There was an article from the August 29th, 2017 Religious News Service, RNS is the acronym, titled, "Where Are the Condemnations of Harvey as God's Punishment?" This is speaking of the Hurricane Harvey. It was authored by Kimberly Winston, and it tackles the question of God punishing humanity because of the increasing sinfulness of man. And when Superstorm Sandy hit the New York metropolitan area in 2012, the floodwaters in lower Manhattan were still rising when some pastors pointed out what to them was obvious. God is systematically destroying America, the Reverend John McTiernan, a conservative Christian pastor who runs a ministry called USA Prophecy, said in a post-Sandy blog entry that has been since removed. So apparently they didn't want that there. It says the reason God was so peeved, he claimed, was the LGBT agenda. And I changed the actual words there. And focus on the family founder, James Dobson, who once blamed the Sandy Hook school shooting on America's acceptance of LGBT marriage and the issue of abortion. Commended the heroic efforts of emergency personnel and the National Guard as they worked to rescue and comfort those stranded and displaced by the flooding. So the Christian community was, despite some of their beliefs of why God did it, they were basically getting behind the efforts. And we'll talk later, okay? And certainly the vast majority of religious groups and leaders respond to all kinds of natural disasters with concern, prayer, and warm outreach, she continues on, as many are doing now. News stories from the flood zones note churches opening as shelters and pastors and others coming to people's aid. Christian, Jewish, and Muslim groups all have relief efforts aimed at Texas. Okay, and then she finalizes with this, but the idea of a vengeful God is nothing new in America. It came here with the Puritans and was firmly established here with the Reverend Jonathan Edwards in 1741 in his sermon. It's a very famous one, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," which is still studied by seminarians and history and English students alike. So this idea of God being an angry God, and sinners in the hands of an angry God is something that's been kind of lived on through the ages. So anytime a natural disaster comes, or somebody wants to attach a particular blame to it. Now let's look at these disasters. Then we're going to look at what the servant of the Lord says about the responsibility, who's responsible for the different disasters, and what they're really, the thing that they're teaching us. Okay, because God has everything, through the testimony of Jesus is for our learning. So, and they're teaching us something about God. And let's look at some of the quick disasters, disasters in quick succession. The Mexican earthquakes in September. On September 7, the earthquake that produced 98 deaths. And then 2 weeks later, on September 19, it was an earthquake that produced 370 deaths. So this was already the beginning of something. And then when we look at the hurricanes, it's not only just this earthquake, but, well, before that, let's look at the California wildfires just, north of Mexico. During the month of October, a series of wildfires broke out through Napa, Lake Sonoma, Mendocino, and Butte counties during severe fire weather conditions, effectively leading to a major red flag warning from much of the Northern California area. In the extreme conditions, shortly after the fires ignited, they rapidly grew to become massive conflagrations spanning from 1,000 to well over 20,000 acres apart within a single day. That's amazing. In addition, the fires have destroyed an estimated 3,500 plus structures and killed at least 41 people, and over 400 people still remain missing as of the last count. The fires burned over 170,000 acres of land and forced over 20,000 people to evacuate. So within a short period of time, you've got these earthquakes, 2 of them, and then you've got this horrible wildfire. Now let's look at the hurricanes. We've actually had 4 hurricanes. Hurricane Harvey at peak intensity prior to landfall in southern Texas on August 25. And 90 people died from that, now this particular count here. There may have been more since, and the damage was more or less $70 billion. And unofficially, this is the 3rd costliest tropical cyclone in U.S. history. Okay, and then and just like a couple weeks later, and that was in August 25 and September 6, Hurricane Irma at peak intensity over the British Virgin Islands on September 6. 134 fatalities, and the damage was $62.87 billion. And, so I mean, and then this was the 4th costliest hurricane on record. So we're not just having storms, but we're having some of the worst in history. And then there was Hurricane Maria, the near peak intensity northwest of the Dominica on September 19th. So that was about 2 weeks after that. So here, wouldn't you call this quick succession? It's very interesting. And this isn't the last one, but this one, 96 fatalities and $51.2 billion in damage. And it's unofficially the 5th costliest on record. And it's the costliest in Puerto Rican history. And then the last one was Hurricane Nate at peak intensity racing toward Louisiana on October 7th. So here, you're talking a couple weeks later. So it seemed to be happening in like 2-week intervals here. And 45 were confirmed dead, and it was estimated at $685 million. So, I mean, look at the damage of all of these in quick succession. When Hillary Clinton made her first public interview since her election, and she did that on the View, and she was talking about how devastating it was and everything. But one of the things that she commented on was she expressed her concern about the catastrophic nature of these events. Now, she did it from a scientific point of view or a scientific curiosity, but we know from the counsel that we have that there's a lot of significance. Now, I can't help but think that maybe Hillary might have kind of wondered, in a spiritual vein, what does this mean? Even though she may not be a spiritual person, I don't know, but it's got to have some sort of spiritual impact, and especially somebody that went through a devastating experience like she did. And it seems like when we become very sensitive to things when we've gone through some difficult time. But it was interesting that she made notice of these things. So people out there are concerned about what's going on with these things. Now let's look at a few of Ellen White's statements dealing with these increasing signs. And a lot of these are from Great Controversy. The first one from Great Controversy. Satan works through the elements also to garner his harvest of unprepared souls. So what we see here is basically who are the ones that end up being the victims? People that are unprepared. And he has studied the secrets of the laboratories of nature, and he uses all his power to control the elements as far as God allows. So we may think that, well, God's the one that initiating this thing, and a lot of people believe this. The sinner in relation to an angry God principle here. But this is what it says here. When he was suffered to afflict Job, how quickly floods and herds, servants, houses, children were swept away, one trouble succeeding another, as in a moment. So we see from the Bible that these type of things happen quickly. Satan did this to Job. It was not God. God allowed it. But God still was in control of the whole thing. It is God that shields his creatures and hedges them in from the power of the destroyer. But the Christian world have shown contempt for the law of Jehovah, and the Lord will do just what he has declared that he would. He will withdraw his blessing from the earth and remove his protecting care. So this is kind of the thing we need to keep in mind when we see these things going on. We don't blame God for it because he's allowing Satan to do his work of destruction, because God is not the destroyer. So keep this in mind as we see these things. let's concentrate on the truth about God, that He cares for His children, He cares for His creatures, and basically these damages go to those that are not prepared. So we need to be prepared, and we need to also be talking to the world about these things that are getting ready to happen. You know, we need to not stay silent when these things happen. Satan has control of all whom God does not especially guard. He will favor and prosper some in order to further his own designs, and he will bring trouble upon others and lead men to believe that it is God who is afflicting them. So the Christian world that, they believe that there's a reason that God is punishing, they need to study their Bibles a little bit more carefully. The day of tests and purification is just upon us. This is from Review and Herald. Signs of a most startling character appear in floods, in hurricanes, in tornadoes, in cloudbursts, and casualties by land and by sea that proclaim the approach of the end of all things. So when we see these things happening in quick succession, we know that we're headed toward the end of all things. The judgments of God are falling on the world that men may be awakened to the fact that Christ will come speedily. So, in a lot of these statements, you'll see that it's very rapid, that Jesus will come speedily. Testimonies, Volume 6. The restraining Spirit of God is even now being withdrawn from the world. Hurricanes, storms, tempests, fire and flood, disasters by sea and land follow each other in quick succession. This is one of the signs that we are very close. Science seeks to explain all these. Hillary, science. So here's a reference that that Hillary kind of fulfilled. The signs thickening around us, telling of the near approach of the Son of God, are attributed to any other than the true cause. Men cannot discern the sentinel angels restraining the four winds, that they shall not blow until the servants of God are sealed. But when God shall bid his angels loose the winds, there shall be such a scene of strife as no pen can picture. So God is still, through his angels, constraining the things going on. Testimonies, Volume 9. The days in which we live are solemn and important. The Spirit of God is gradually but surely being withdrawn from the earth. Plagues and judgments are already falling upon the despisers of the grace of God. The calamities by land and sea, the unsettled state of society, the alarms of war are portentous. They forecast approaching events of the greatest magnitude. These things are telling us something, brothers and sisters. The agencies of evil are combining their forces and consolidating. They are strengthening for the last great crisis. Great changes are soon to take place in our world, and the final movements will be rapid ones. So again, there's this quick succession. And then in Prophets and Kings it says, the time is at hand when there will be sorrow in the world that no human balm can heal. The Spirit of God is being withdrawn. Disasters by sea and by land follow one another in quick succession. How frequently we hear of earthquakes and tornadoes, of destruction by fire and flood, with great loss of life and property. Apparently these calamities are capricious outbreaks of disorganized, unregulated forces of nature, wholly beyond the control of man. But in them all, God's purpose may be read. They are among the agencies by which he seeks to arouse men and women to a sense of their danger. Now let me ask you this. When these things just started happening, and it was one right after the other, how did that make you feel? Did you think that there was something that God was trying to tell us through these things? Is that, or did it just kind of brush you by as well? It's just one of those seasons. Because these things, we see these hurricane seasons coming and going every year, but this one had these major, some of the worst in rapid succession. And it wasn't just that, it was the earthquake, it was the fires. Now listen to this last statement here regarding the calamities. Men in responsible positions will not only ignore and despise the Sabbath themselves, but from the sacred desk will urge upon the people the observance of the first day of the week, pleading tradition and custom in behalf of this man-made institution. They will point to calamities on land and sea, to the storms of wind, the floods, the earthquakes, the destruction by fire as judgments indicating God's displeasure because Sunday is not sacredly observed. So these things are in connection with the Sunday law. And when we see these things happen as rapidly as they have happened, we'll know that this is just right upon us. It's getting ready to happen. These calamities will increase more and more. One disaster will follow close upon the heels of another. And those who make void the law of God will point to the few who are keeping the Sabbath of the fourth commandment as the ones who are bringing wrath upon the world. This falsehood is Satan's device that he may ensnare the unwary. So we know this is getting ready to happen. Now, so far I've just talked about the natural disasters, okay? But there was another event that happened that kind of falls in place with all of these things, but it was a man-made thing here. On the night of October 1, 2017, a gunman opened fire on a crowd of concert goers at the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival on the Las Vegas Strip in Nevada, leaving 58 people dead and 546 injured between 10:05 and 10:15 p.m., just 10 minutes. And 64-year-old Stephen Paddock of Mesquite, Nevada, fired hundreds of rifle rounds, allegedly. There are some theories about it, so that's the only reason I'm saying allegedly. But rounds from his suite on the 32nd floor of the nearby Mandalay Bay Hotel. About an hour after Paddock fired his last shot into the crowd, he was found dead in the room from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. His motive is unknown. And then it says that the incident is the deadliest mass shooting committed by an individual in the United States. The shooting reignited the debate about gun laws in the U.S. And apparently Jimmy Kimmel, in his late night opening remarks right after the tragedy, with passionate and heartfelt tears, begged for stricter gun laws as a remedy for this insanity, making his plea political. And now the question is gun control legislation the answer to this? I mean, because we've had the right to bear arms for a long, long time, and we haven't seen things quite on this scale. So do we blame it on the guns? But there's a different answer. According to the Pen of Inspiration, gives a reason why these things happen. And so these things seem to be somewhat in connection. And to me, what she says is the only thing that truly makes sense. And this is from Great Controversy. Those who teach the people to lightly regard the commandments of God sow disobedience to reap disobedience. Let the restraint imposed by the divine law be wholly cast aside, and human laws would soon be disregarded. So there's a connection here. Do you hear this connection between God's law and human laws? If you take away God's law, the human laws will follow. So because God forbids dishonest practices, coveting, lying, and defrauding, men are ready to trample upon his statutes as a hindrance to their worldly prosperity. But the results of banishing these precepts would be upon his statutes as a hindrance to their worldly prosperity. But the results of banishing these precepts would be such as they do not anticipate. If the law were not binding, why should any fear to transgress? Property would no longer be safe. Men would obtain their neighbor's possession by violence, and the strongest would become richest. Life itself would not be respected. The marriage vow would no longer stand as a sacred bulwark to protect the family. He who had the power would, if he desired, take his neighbor's wife by violence. The fifth commandment would be set aside with the fourth. Children would not shrink from taking the life of their parents. Now, when was this written? This is a great controversy. That was, 18, I know there was an 1888 version, but there was, but anyway, so this was, a long time ago. And yet, all of these things are being fulfilled now as if they were just in this morning's news. This children would not shrink from taking the life of their parents. There's the Menendez brothers. That's something I think is being on television now. You know, they're reenacting that whole Menendez brothers thing, where the two sons murdered their parents. You know, and it was for riches and gain. You know, so this thing is happening here. The fifth commandment would be set aside. Children would shrink from taking the life of their parents if by so doing they could obtain the desire of their corrupt hearts. The civilized world would become a horde of robbers and assassins, and peace, resting, and happiness would be banished from the earth. Already the doctrine that men are released from obedience to God's requirements has weakened the force of moral obligation and opened the floodgates of iniquity upon the world. Lawlessness, dissipation, and corruption are sweeping in upon us like an overwhelming tide. In the family, Satan is at work. His banner waves even in professed Christian households. There is envy, evil surmising, hypocrisy, estrangement, emulation, strife, betrayal of sacred trust, indulgence of lust. The whole system of religious practices and doctrines which should form the foundation and framework of social life seems to be a tottering mass, ready to fall to ruin. The vilest of criminals, when thrown into prison for their offenses, are often made the recipients of gifts and attentions as if they had attained an enviable distinction. It's amazing. All of these things are happening right now, just like this. Great publicity is given to the character of these criminals and crimes. The press publishes the revolting details of vice, thus initiating others into the practice of fraud, robbery, and murder. And Satan exults in the success of his hellish schemes. The infatuation of vice, the wanton taking of life, the terrible increase of intemperance and iniquity of every order and degree should arouse all who fear God to inquire what can be done to stay the tide of evil. And then this last paragraph. Courts of justice are corrupt. Rulers are actuated by desire for gain, and love of sensual pleasure and intemperance has beclouded the faculties of many, so that Satan has almost complete control of them. Jurists are perverted, bribed, deluded. Drunkenness and revelry, passion, envy, dishonesty of every sort are represented among those who administer the laws. And then there's this quote from Isaiah 59:14, justice standeth afar off, for truth is fallen in the street, and equity cannot enter. So God in His Word has prophesied that these things would be manifest in the last days. Now let's look real quickly at Matthew chapter 24, and verses 3 through 5 and 11 through 13. We've got a clue right here as to what would be one of the signs in the end here. Matthew 24, verses 3 through 5 and 11 through 13. Verse 3, and as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? So the disciples in a private meeting, this wasn't a public thing, but in a private meeting, asked Jesus these questions. Give us an indication of when these things shall be. And Jesus answered and said unto them, take heed that no man deceive you. So his first concern is with deception, that no man would deceive you here. And then the next text says, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And some people believe this says, I am of Christ. So it's really pointing to, Christian bodies. I mean, that, if they represent or misrepresent Jesus, then, that they are guilty of deception. And then verse 11, and many false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. So Jesus is giving us a picture of one of the great signs of the end. Now the word iniquity, and we've talked about this before, found in verse 12, can be literally translated lawlessness, referring to a position against God's holy Ten Commandment law. The love spoken of is agape, the highest form that comes from God. And this is the love that waxes cold when God's Ten Commandments are done away with. When God's love melts away from our hearts, atrocities are the eventual, inevitable result, individually and on a societal level. So the Ten Commandments really have a place, in the condition of the world, and individually and as far as the society. Now, in closing here, I've got one more thing I wanted to kind of touch on. And it is interesting that all of these calamities fall near the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, which is now upon us. Now, back in 1999, the papacy and the Lutheran Church declared that Luther had a mere misunderstanding in regard to justification. And that started in 1999, which has led up to now they're back. They're in a common union. But do you think that Luther had just a mere misunderstanding of justification? Now, and I'm going to read something in a minute, which talks about what happened with Luther. And the Lutherans and Catholics now are together in their understanding of the Eucharist. You know what the Eucharist is? It's the doctrine of transubstantiation. Do you know what that is? Okay? Where a sinful man, a priest, can pray over the bread and wine, and their wine is fermented, and change them literally into the body and blood of Christ. Millions of martyrs lost their lives for refusing to believe in this abominable papal doctrine. And I believe if you look close, it's really closer to a satanic ritual when you think about the whole idea that it's literally Christ's blood. That's crazy. So, but now they're in agreement with that now. They're participating in that. So what prompted Martin Luther to turn away from the papal church? Now notice again the words of the inspiration found in the Great Controversy. So it goes in, Luther was still a true son of the papal church. Luther really had no intention of going anyplace else. He loved his church and had no thought that he would ever be anything else. In the providence of God, he was led to visit Rome. He pursued his journey on foot, lodging at the monasteries on the way. At a convent in Italy, he was filled with wonder at the wealth, magnificence, and luxury that he had witnessed. Endowed with a princely revenue, the monks dwelt in splendid apartments, attired themselves in the richest and most costly robes, and feasted at a sumptuous table. With painful misgivings, Luther contrasted this scene with the self-denial and hardship of his own life. His mind was becoming perplexed. He believed that, it was through the hardship that he was being drawn closer to God. At last he beheld in the distance the seven-hilled city. With deep emotion he prostrated himself upon the earth, exclaiming, "Holy Rome, I salute thee." So he had this love for his church. He entered the city, visited the churches, listened to the marvelous tales repeated by priests and monks, and performed all the ceremonies required. Everywhere he looked upon scenes that filled him with astonishment and horror. He saw that iniquity existed among all classes of the clergy. He heard indecent jokes from prelates and was filled with horror at their awful profanity, even during Mass. As he mingled with the monks and citizens, he met dissipation, debauchery. Turn where he would, in the place of sanctity he found profanation. It is incredible, he wrote, what sins and atrocities are committed in Rome. They must be seen and heard to be believed. So that it is usual to say, if there be a hell, Rome is built above it. It is an abyss whence all sins proceed. You know what he's saying? He's saying that Rome is the seat, Satan's seat. Because where do all sins proceed from? But he was speaking that of Rome. That's pretty amazing when you think about it. And then this last paragraph, by recent decretal an indulgence had been promised by the Pope to all who should ascend upon their knees Pilate's staircase, said to have been descended by our Savior on leaving the Roman judgment hall, and to have been miraculously conveyed from Jerusalem to Rome. Now, Pilate's staircase is in quotes. Do you think that this really happened? Do you think this was just, again, a falsehood? Okay, but this is what they were taught, and a lot of the monks actually believed it. Luther was one day devoutly climbing these steps when suddenly a voice like thunder seemed to say to him, "The just shall live by faith." And of course, that Romans 1:17 is quoted. He sprung upon his feet and hastened from the place in shame and horror. That text never lost its power upon his soul. From that time, he saw more clearly than ever before the fallacy of trusting in human works for salvation and the necessity of constant faith in the merits of Christ. His eyes had been opened and were never again to be closed to the delusions of the papacy. So did he just have a misunderstanding? Okay, his eyes would never be closed to the delusions of the papacy. When he turned his face from Rome, he had turned away also in heart, and from that time the separation grew wider until he severed all connection with the papal church. Misunderstanding. So who had that misunderstanding? It wasn't Luther. Now, what was the defining principle described by Paul after Romans 1:17 regarding the heart of the papacy? Because I think, Luther didn't just understand that little portion of it. He understood the whole chapter, and he witnessed that when he went to Rome. He saw what followed Romans 1:17, the following text. That's what he saw, and that was one of the reasons why he ended up separating from Rome. Now let's take a look at just this one text. Luther founded the Reformation on Romans 1:17, the just shall live by faith. And this is what verse 17 says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness." Now, I had to kind of struggle a little bit with that. What does it mean, the truth and hold the truth in unrighteousness? But if you look at Strong's, and I like to look at Strong's because Strong's kind of gives, other parallel synonym. Thank you. I couldn't think of the word synonym. Synonym. So, and one of the first synonym is injustice. So unrighteousness is injustice. And then there's moral wrongfulness of character, life, or act. But here, this word is very interesting. Iniquity. So what is the word iniquity? Isn't that lawlessness? Didn't we just see that in Matthew 24? So this is kind of synonymous with lawlessness right here. So that's what it's talking about. This unrighteousness is lawlessness, because we know that's what unrighteousness is anyway. So Luther understood this. Paul describes the characteristic of this great and mighty church that would call themselves the mother church. But this is the last statement here in closing. And I believe that iniquity literally means lawlessness. I believe that Luther understood this and applied it to the papacy. It says, "No error accepted by the Christian world strikes more boldly against the authority of heaven. None is more directly opposed to the dictates of reason. None is more pernicious in its results than the modern doctrine, so rapidly gaining ground that God's law is no longer binding upon men. Every nation has its laws, which command respect and obedience. No government could exist without them, and can it be conceived that the Creator of the heavens and the earth has no law to govern the beings He has made?" So we would agree that every country needs laws, right? But why would we say that God doesn't need a law, that law is done away with? It just doesn't make sense. Suppose that prominent ministers were publicly to teach that the statutes which govern their land and protect the rights of its citizens were not obligatory, that they restricted the liberties of the people and therefore ought not to be obeyed. How long would such men be tolerated in the pulpit? I mean, we hear all the time about the rule of law. So the rule of law does exist in the minds of people. But is it a graver offense to disregard the law of states and nations than to trample upon those divine precepts which are the foundation of all government. So God's commandments are the foundation of all government and all laws. But we want to do away with that. And we read earlier that what would happen if God's law was done away with. So brothers and sisters, God's law is the issue. The foundation of his kingdom and his character. So if we do away with God's law, we do away with his character as well, not only the foundation of his kingdom. So where do we stand in relation to this in our hearts? The Sunday law is on the horizon. Where do we stand?